Hi everyone, it's absolutely fantastic to be here. I've spent the last few weeks on the road across Europe, and most of my talks have to start by explaining I'm Scottish. I get really excited about this topic, so I'll try and speak slowly. So it's an absolute privilege to be here and get all hand wavy and talk as fast as I like and be pretty confident everyone knows what I'm talking about. So what are we going to do over the course of the next half hour or so? Well, we're going to take a look at what's happened with AI over the last year and a half or so. We're then going to take a bit of a look at the new capabilities that AI starts to give you, and we'll frame that through the lens of one or two different examples. And then to wrap up, we'll try and keep it as practical as possible. We'll take a look at some of the things that you might want to think about for your own organization if you're looking to start exploring these technologies in more detail or start to use them in different ways, okay? So, kicking off, what's happened with AI? Well, probably your perception of AI has been similar to mine. It's been built up over many, many years by Hollywood, by the press, and it kind of goes along a similar route. AI goes mad and kills people, or AI pretends to fall in love with people and then leaves them heartbroken and destitute. Incidentally, that movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson is fantastic. If you're looking to travel home today, any distance, that's a great movie to watch. And there's actually a bit of a backstory that plays into the new voice that OpenAI has started bedding in. But this is a kind of terrifying perspective that AI has built up in our minds. And of course, this was all until the OpenAI team launched ChatGPT not so long ago. And suddenly, for the very first time ever, if you know how to interact with a text box and a button, you've got the opportunity to interact with artificial intelligence firsthand. That's a massive breakthrough. Suddenly we can all create haikus where the first letter of every word is the same, or we can plan new holidays, or we can work on more elaborate project plans for the things at work. It's the very first time that we've really got close to that type of interaction. And it's not surprising then really that the growth was exceptionally fast. It only took 2 months to get to 100 million monthly active users. And to put that in context, these are some of the biggest platforms that we knew until that point. Now, my colleague Pete is in the front row here, and I know he's going to kick me afterwards and say Threads was faster, but I don't think that counts. They stole people from Instagram, and I like this slide, so I'm keeping it. But the reality here is this volume of people, the really interesting thing isn't that they're visiting ChatGPT, it's not that they're visiting Claude, it's not that they're interacting with these services that's the important point. The important point is these are some of the very first interactions between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. Every one of these interactions is a collaboration between those two. And that's a fundamental difference. So what's actually going on under the hood with these things? Well, in reality, they're nothing more than statistical prediction machines. That's all they are. It's really simple. And if you give them a body of text, they're really, really good at predicting what the next character is going to be. However, if it repeats that a few times, it goes from predicting the next character to suddenly starting to predict the next word. And it does that a few more times. It goes from predicting words to predicting sentences, and then sentences to paragraphs, and paragraphs to eventually the works of Shakespeare. But ultimately, this is all statistical prediction. But because these models are trained on incredible volumes of data sourced from the internet and various different sources, it's starting to get wider now that multimodal is more of a thing, it's actually got a huge amount of our cultural nuances, our understanding of the world baked into these things. So these statistical predictions that it produces actually starts to look really like the types of things that humans could potentially say. Why is that important to us? Well, these often are large language models, not in all cases. We'll take a look at some other examples in a minute, but these are large language models, and that language part is really important because ultimately all of our businesses are language businesses. All of our regulations are language regulations. All of our customer interactions are language interactions. So any place where we're using language in our business, in our social lives, or anywhere, there's a potential opportunity, and it's not necessarily something that we should always do, but there's a potential opportunity to start looking at what could a large language model start to do. Now, I did say that generative AI isn't all about large language models. To give you an example, in the image space, just over a year ago, if we put in a prompt, you can just see it possibly at the bottom here. If you prompted to say, give me a Victoria crown pigeon with striking blue plumage and a red crest, this is what it would have given you. And probably you'd have been phoning up all of the industrial units along the Clyde asking if they're starting to put kind of dangerous things out into the river. However, you fast forward just a year to 2 months ago, suddenly this is what it's producing. The quality's come through incredibly in a very short period of time. But it doesn't even stop there, because you look just a few weeks ago and suddenly OpenAI launched Sora, and now you can do exactly the same with text going to video. So this is generated entirely from a text prompt put into Sora, and it gives us back this quality of video. And it could do it with all kinds of things. So for example, someone walking along a busy Tokyo street, unless you're a former art director, this is probably going to be really quite convincing the first time you see it. You might have a bit of attention to detail, see some funky movements around the face or some strange gaits on people, but ultimately the quality here, given where we were just over a year ago, is quite exceptional. You can do similar with countryside scenes. You can do similar with cute little images. I usually put this in here just to get an awe from the audience somewhere. However, it's not always that positive. I'm going to give one more example here. This is poor Martin Lewis not so long ago.
Musk presented his new project, in which he has already invested more than $3 billion. Musk's new project opens up great investment opportunities for British citizens. No project has ever given such opportunities to residents of the country, given the interesting features of the app and having seen how it works.
So you can probably all guess that isn't Martin Lewis. It's not him visually. It's not his voice. That's two different deep fakes played together. So while these new tools give us incredible new capabilities and incredible opportunities, it completely changes the risk landscape and the things that we need to be concerned about in many different areas as well. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what's been happening over the last year and a half or so. We're now going to start to think about what are the capabilities that we start to get from some of these technologies, because they really are fundamentally different to traditional technology. And the way we think about this at Waracle is through the lens of 3 areas. First of all, automate, then enhance, and then experience. Now, I think no need to tell a tech audience exactly what we mean by automate. Really what we're looking to do here is how can we think about focusing the expertise in our organizations by giving the opportunity to eliminate repetitive knowledge work. Now, I would hazard caution on this at all times, because these are brand new technologies. There are very, very, very few examples where I would say you should adopt this for pure automation. That might be the case in a few years' time once these things start to become more controlled and better understood. But at this stage, automation probably isn't something that you really want to be heavily focused on. Enhance is slightly different. Enhance is really all about productivity. And what we're looking to do here is say, how can we hypercharge, how can we superpower the employees in our organizations by giving them really personalized, contextualized information right at the point when they need it? Really making it easier for them to do their job more effectively, more consistently, and potentially even at greater skill. And we're starting to see this really coming through now in the industry. We've been speaking about this for quite a few months, but we're now for the first time starting to see the evidence of this starting to play out in the economy. PwC actually just released a paper, I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, 4.8 times productivity growth in sectors that are fastest at adopting AI at the moment. Given that there has been a big productivity lag for a few years, this is quite a significant breakthrough. You're starting to see some really big reputable brands that are starting to adopt this into its products. So Klarna, for example, came out just a few months ago to talk about how it's able to use artificial intelligence to be able to do the job of around 700 people. Now, that both excites me and terrifies me, because I really want to know what are those 700 people doing now. Hopefully they are redeployed into doing things that are giving more value, they're more creative, hopefully more rewarding for them as well. But we're starting to see many more of these stories coming through. However, the real area that I think is interesting is in the experiential side of things. This is where we've got the opportunity to start building brand new relationships with our customers, start to think about how can we simplify complex journeys and decisions that they have to make. And this is really where things start to get really different from traditional software. And to understand that, we have to go back in time a little bit. So if we go back pre-1950s, The way we scaled our businesses was with humans. If you wanted to get a business loan, for example, you would go down to your local bank, you'd speak to the local branch manager. They would probably have gone to school with your parents, they would know your kids, they'd understand your hobbies, and they would work with you, human to human, to understand what do you need and how can we help you? How can we reach something that's going to really work for you? And that's what we've been calling real-time human intelligence. You've got the humans together in a room, face-to-face, working on these things together. But there's a challenge with this, which is it's not particularly scalable and it's very, very expensive to try and grow. So round about the 50s, suddenly we come up with this idea of software. And this helped us to scale our businesses, it helped us to reach new people, it helped us to industrialize in many ways, but it did come at a big risk. And I think some of these risks, some of the things that we gave up round about that time, probably we've forgotten about. We've lost that human contact. Every time we're thinking about software, we're thinking about what are we going to do and what are we not going to do. And if some pesky user comes along and they want to give you additional context that they think is important for their situation, we're going to throw an error of some kind, call them a bad human, send them on their way and probably ignore them after that. That's something that we've lost since we've moved to software. And we have to do that because software can only do what it's been programmed to do. So you've got a BA perhaps is going to define, we're going to do this, we're not going to do that, these are the inputs, these are the outputs. We've got designers that are controlling how we interact with this software with drop-downs, with radio buttons and various different techniques. We've got developers that are encoding all of our organizational rules and ideas into the code. And then we've got testers that are saying, if this, then that, it works, brilliant. Otherwise, it's borked and send it back to the developers. Okay, but all of this ultimately is creating very complicated rule sets that execute on a server. And these rule sets have been created a long way away from the customer's context. So it doesn't necessarily understand exactly what that user needs to achieve in that moment. So there's a huge amount of intelligence in building software, but this is design time human intelligence. It's all front-loaded away from that customer context. And then when it actually executes in the customer context, there isn't really much intelligence that's going on there. This is fundamentally changing now with the new generation of artificial intelligence that's coming through, because for the very first time, we can take intelligence and start to embed it into the software close to the user context. That's a completely different situation. So we're thinking about this as runtime digital intelligence, but it starts to ask big questions of our organizations. Would you be able to release software if you didn't know what it was going to ask the customer, how it's going to respond to different customers' queries? That's a very different thing. We have to rethink our whole model about how we create software, how we organize ourselves, how we deploy that, and how we manage that in an operational context. To give you some examples, let's think about healthcare, first of all. If you imagine in a healthcare, perhaps in a mental health space, for example, you would have to get close to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, somebody that could really help you and work close with them. But we all know we've got major bottlenecks in the healthcare system. And then you move forward a few years and we've started to digitize some things in the healthcare industry, usually through forms and so on, sometimes through teleconferencing, but the reality is it's still fairly constrained. But this is where I think one of the best examples that I've seen so far of large language models being used starts to come into play. And it's from a company called Wobot Health. What Wobot Health do is they produce software, they produce products that help people that are in mental health crisis. So these are people that for some reason or other cannot access the healthcare that they need, they can't access the medication that they need, but they desperately need help in that moment. Now, needless to say, in that scenario, it would be absolutely catastrophic to allow a large language model to go rogue and give them various different bits of advice just randomly conjured up. We just can't allow that to happen. But what the team at Wobot Health have done that's exceptional is they've understood that a large language model isn't just about the generation, it's actually also about the listening. So they're using large language models to listen to patients in these moments of crisis and use that digital capability to scale our ability to listen. And then once it's done that, is able to then determine what exactly is happening here and what physician-generated response are we going to give back to that patient in that moment. So what the patient sees is only ever something that's been generated and approved by people who deeply understand the scenario, the situation, the conditions, and the appropriate responses. But the scale, the ability to listen to patients that are under distress and be able to help them actually comes from the large language model. And it's actually really quite simple to do that. All the large language model is doing is interpreting the human conversation. That's often coming in through text, but it could come in through voice and various different sources. It's then understanding what's going on and redirecting to that pre-approved message, and then ultimately responding with that human response through that same interface. Okay, so a very different type of use for a large language model from what we would typically think of. I'll give you an example. Many people here use Spotify? Show of hands. Okay, most people use Spotify. So if you go back a few years ago, if you wanted to get the latest album, you'd have to go down to a record store. You'd be hoping that the record store would have it in. Perhaps the person behind the counter knows you and say, yeah, you were in, you got your Rick Astley a few weeks ago. Have you heard of Right Said Fred? I think you'll love Right Said Fred. And so you get that human interaction, that real-time human intelligence to help you understand the types of music that you like and get something that's going to, keep you enjoying your music at home. And then over a few years, we started to digitize music in the same way as we're actually digitizing aspects of human thought here. And for the very first time, you start to get streaming models and you start to become part of a large segment of people. So we can make recommendations based on, we think you've got similar taste to these other million people, therefore we'll nudge you in this direction. You're one of a cohort of a big, big group of people. Now, what Spotify's done now, which I think is really interesting, and actually is a bit of an audiophile, it makes me slightly uncomfortable, I've got to be honest, but I think it's a really interesting use, is they're using a large language model now to understand all of your listening history over the last few years, where you were when you were doing it, what you were doing and what you were listening to, and then it's able to use that reasoning capability to suggest what you might want to listen to next. So essentially, this is like radio, and you're in the car and you're listening to the radio, but it's personalized to you. You're no longer part of a cohort of 1 million people, you're in a cohort of one. This is understanding your tastes, your preferences, what you tend to do at that time of day, and giving recommendations, suggestions, and even discussions about what the lyrics mean and what the band have come from, what their background is, all specific to you. And again, this is really quite simple. Spotify's been gathering this data for many, many years, exposes that out through its personalization API, passes it on to OpenAI to do the reasoning about the music and the performers and so on. And then again, it pumps it into Sonatic API, which is actually a business that Spotify bought a few years ago, which converts that text from a large language model into voice. And you suddenly get this radio-esque voice giving you all of the information in between the different chains of songs that you want to listen to. I'm going to give one more example, this time in financial services. Again, as I said earlier, years ago, you would have gone down to a local bricks and mortar store and spoken to real people in the bank. And then a few years ago, we started moving on to online banking, onto mobile banking. Suddenly, you've got the flexibility to transfer money, check your balance, and do some of these really kind of utilitarian things with the power of the phone in your hand. But what's happening now is a shift towards much more abstract thinking. Now, this doesn't replace the ability to transfer money. This doesn't replace the ability to read what your balance is. But what this is capable of doing, tools like Clio, is it will reason with you about your finances and help you plan for the future. So, for example, I could use Clio to say, I want to take my daughters to Disneyland in a couple of years' time. I would say, okay, well, that's good, Gary. Let's come up with a plan. 12 McDonald's a week, that's probably not going to cut it. You could cut back and then you could put a bit more away to save. It'll actually help me to reason and plan, and then it will coach me through that journey as well. And once more, this is a really, really simple journey. And this is an important message here, because to work with some of these large language models doesn't require armies of data scientists or some of the things that we thought we needed when we worked with machine learning. These are largely API calls that we're working with. This is a much lower entry bar to be able to do these types of things. So what Clio are doing is they're using the open banking APIs to get a view of your finances. Again, they're putting that into OpenAI and then exposing that out through a handy and useful mobile app. Okay? Really, really simple, but exceptionally powerful. And this is tailored both in terms of the advice that it's giving and the communication that it's offering you to exactly what your tastes are. So what I'm saying here is the new generation of AI that we're starting to see coming through, this fundamentally changes how we build relationships with our customers. It changes the types of products and the types of services that we should be creating. But in order to do that, we need to think differently about how we build software. We're not going to have the luxury of being able to say, we always want it to behave exactly like this, say these things and respond only with these things. We need to develop new capabilities, and we're seeing more and more of these design patterns, more and more of these architectural patterns emerging that allow us to do that in a safe and effective way. But if you think back over the examples that I gave a few minutes ago, Wobot Health, for example, that's all about listening to our users. Now, it does do some aspect of reasoning, it does some aspect of communication through physician-generated responses, but it's fundamentally listening. You think about Spotify, it's reasoning about the types of music that you've listened to for many, many years and where you were and what you were doing when you were listening to that music, okay? Now, reason sounds like a deeply human thing, and that probably makes people in here feel really quite uncomfortable. But the reality is a large language model is doing something akin to reasoning. Not necessarily in the same way as a human would do that, but an airplane can fly even though it doesn't flap its wings. So why can't these things be mimicking these types of human qualities just in a slightly different way? And then you think about the Clio example, that's largely about communication. Again, it does tap into reasoning, it does tap into listening, but it's largely about how it communicates effectively about the types of changes that you want to make about your finances and how you keep on track with the goals that you want to move towards. So my challenge to you here is, if we think about those three things, listen, reason, and communicate, as deeply human qualities, and we think about large language models as something that's able to digitize aspects of those human thought processes, that starts to change the underlying economics of our organizations and about how we build and develop and launch products and services. So if you had an unlimited budget to recruit an unlimited number of people with an unlimited type of skills to work closely with every single customer that you have, how would you do business differently? Because this is essentially what happens when we digitize anything. You think about digitizing music with Spotify, suddenly music's available 24 hours a day, it's unlimited, there's loads of different fundamental changes that happen when you digitize something. And we're getting those same types of changes around aspects of human thought. Now, I would reiterate what I said earlier. We don't want to be taking the rails off and allowing these things to automate entirely and do it on their own. But when these things enhance and supplement humans, or they're used in very controlled ways close to the customer, that can be an exceptionally powerful capability when we learn to manage that. So those are some of the new capabilities that it gives us. I said I wanted to wrap up with something really quite practical and some of the things that we want to think about. So if your organization is thinking about how can you start to use some of these new technologies, the first starting point is, what is that vision and strategy for how you're going to use that within your organization? And I'm not proposing for a second that we boil the ocean with this. This could potentially be really quite lightweight. It depends on what you're doing and the environment that you're doing it in. But the starting point for all of this has to be risks and ethics. This is a fundamentally new technology. It's got new challenges that we've never experienced before, so we have to spend the time understanding what are we willing for it to do and what are we fundamentally not willing for it to do. We need to think about how this changes the operating model. If we start to deploy these large language models within our organization, this is a new form of intelligence. Do we centralize that and have that handled by a single team? Or do you start to decentralize it down to the point where it's used within different product teams and so on? How you organize that and how you govern that is fundamentally important. Then we need to start thinking about prioritizing use cases and business cases. I've deliberately not put this first because there's actually, once you start to scrape away at it, there's many, many opportunities where we can use this. I've been arguing for a while that large language models, the new generation of artificial intelligence, is largely a design challenge. If we didn't make any more technological breakthroughs in this space for the next 10 years, we've actually still got more capability than we probably know what to do with for the next 10 years. So the big challenge here is about design. How do we design systems, products, services, organizations, societies that can use these things in sensible, sympathetic, and safe ways? Planning for the people impact, and I actually spoke with someone just at the beginning. This is fundamentally important. You know, even if you don't think you're going to be displacing people from your organization with these technologies, they could still be scary, it could still have an impact on the role, and people need to be guided safely through that journey. Okay, so don't just throw these technologies in there and see what happens. It has to be a very carefully managed process. Establishing measures and evaluation. And this actually becomes much easier in some ways than traditional software. I think in traditional software, we often come up with many proxy measures for what are we doing and how are we doing it, and is this having the impact that we want? And then we all break those and pretend that it's having a phenomenal impact. But if you start to think of these technologies more like humans than traditional software, then actually many of the genuine business metrics that we have are really quite relevant for measuring the progress and the success of these technologies. And then finally, very deliberately finally, thinking about that technology approach. And that technology approach is probably going to change over time. So with our teams, for example, we work with organizations to move really quickly about exploring opportunities. At those early stages, we probably start with a proprietary model from Claude or from OpenAI, because you can move fast, they're powerful, and they allow you to explore the boundaries. But over a few days and a few weeks, you then start to move back to see what smaller, really basic model can we achieve the same impact with? And quite often that's multiple different models chained together. So your technology approach is probably going to change as you're in different stages of that innovation process, and you then start to think about moving to productionize. So just coming to the final part now, some of the things that we've been seeing in the market is fundamentally businesses at the moment are focusing on integrating and evolving their existing products and services. Now, at Waracle, we tend to work with heavily regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, and energy. And every one of our clients is focusing on how they can do this kind of thing just now. Now, what I mean by that is they're not necessarily throwing out everything that they've got, but they are starting to think differently about the customer journeys and the internal productivity that they have by embedding these into existing systems. We're slowly now starting to see some businesses focusing on brand new products and service offerings. Now, this is often in the startup space or the scale-up space where there's a little bit less organizational momentum that needs to turn around. But then the difference there is for a new business, they don't have the same data, they don't have the same IP, they don't have the same knowledge to be able to put into that intelligence. And if all you're being is a thin wrapper around a large language model, you probably don't have a protective moat. So if you're in a larger enterprise or an SME of some kind, you've got huge amounts of experience, knowledge, data, you're actually in a really good position to take real advantage of these types of technologies. And then the final case is future business models. If you think back to 2008, suddenly we have an economic downturn, lots of people hit the market, they start to innovate and come up with new ideas. Right at the time when the smartphone arrives and we start to get new capabilities coming out like Uber and Spotify and all these kinds of things, we're going to see something similar happening here. We're just a little bit too early in the journey to understand what these things are going to be. So this is more about keeping your eye on the market and understanding where do we start to see new things emerging. It's going to happen really soon, but we're not quite there yet to be able to know exactly what they will be. If the experiential side of this is of interest to you, myself and one or two colleagues have pulled together an ebook on generative AI for digital experience. If you scan this QR code, that will take you through to my own LinkedIn. If you connect there, I'll make sure you can get a copy of the book. You can have a copy of the slides. And of course, feel free just to chat as well if you want to do that. Thank you.
We've probably got about 10, 15 minutes for questions. So again, you can either use Slido or stick your hand up and we'll get a live microphone to you. Okay. Anybody got a question? Right, just there. I think that's Jim. There we go. James, just at the pillar there, please.
Do you mind passing the microphone?
Thanks for your talk. So I'm just trying to discern what the key competitive edge is from this, because it seems to me that unless you've got data, and data needs to be organised in a particular way to really be effective. What would be your view on how you be competitive, either as a startup or as an incumbent?
Okay, yeah, good question. Sorry, is the power mic on?
Not yet. We're working on it.
Yep. Test 1, 2. 1, 2, test 1, 2.
I'll just go back up to the doings. It's probably the easiest thing to do.
It's okay, I'll just come here. It's all good. Yeah. Yes, very good question. Thank you. Are we good? Okay. Yes, thank you. So firstly, you're absolutely right that data is important. Data is exceptionally important, and I would never argue that it isn't. That said, for traditional machine learning, having your data, large volumes of data, cleaned and ready to train a model, that you just can't escape that. One of the things I'd say that's slightly different with generative AI, we're certainly seeing it when we're working with organizations that are right at the edge of putting things out there into the market, is you can almost think about this a bit more like your best employee looking at a data set. So say, for example, if you think about a customer service agent looking at somebody's accounts on a screen, and perhaps there's bits of missing data in there, a really experienced agent will probably be able to look at that and deal with the ambiguity, deal with the missing data, and be able to make suggestions on what that next action would be or what they would look for. The reason I'm calling this out is, again, data is exceptionally important. However, large language models are a little bit more capable at handling ambiguity than potentially traditional models would be. So if you're working with anyone who says you need a 2-year data cleansing and data swamp project before you can get started with this, I would say that's simply not true. You can actually start significantly earlier. In terms of unique capabilities, that's a very difficult thing to say. What's that differentiating edge is very difficult to call out at this stage, because I think a lot of people are innovating in very similar ways. I think one of the key things that I would call out is that hyper-personalization and contextualization. So where we've been, I think, in the industry for quite a few years is really looking at an attention economy. We've been focusing on getting everyone's attention in constantly, the whole time. And to some extent, I think that's become quite exhausting for people. People are starting to actually realize how addicted to their mobile phones they are. This new technology starts to shift us from an attention economy much more towards a relationship economy. And I think we know from some experiments that were done back in the 60s with some very, very basic bots that people forget quite quickly that they're dealing with something that isn't a human, and they start to open up and talk really quite freely. So I think whatever your organization is, if you start to think less about how you get attention and more about how do you build a relationship and start to have that long-lasting relationship, I think the specificity that comes from that around your organization, the types of terminology that you would use, exactly what your customer needs are, that hyper-fixation on personalization and contextualization, I think is probably one of those differentiating things. But it's differentiation more because you've got the ability to go to a much lower precise level than we've ever had before. So your organization will use that in a very different way to my organization would. And I think that's probably where some of the early signs of uniqueness are coming from.
Yeah, thanks very much. And then the risk factor, obviously, potentially of the model being poisoned, as we saw with the Microsoft example.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a critical concern. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many big concerns dealing with these types of models. To give you examples, bias. We hear about bias all the time. We hear about hallucination all the time. Show of hands, does anybody know any colleagues, friends, family that aren't biased? Does anyone know anyone that doesn't hallucinate? Some of these types of things are things that we don't attribute to software. But the reality is we've actually got really good mechanisms with dealing with other humans. And once you start to change your frame of mind around what do you accept, is it an additional voice, or is it something that you assume is binary, yes or no answer? Once you start to evolve how we think about that technology, I think that becomes really quite different. To the more specific things like injections and shifts and so on like that, there are good architectural approaches that are coming out. I think we've seen many cases where organizations haven't adopted them at the right time. So models like air gapping and so on that allow us to make sure that queries coming in from customers don't go directly into a large language model. There's various different air gaps and stuff that can keep it safe. Putting the right practices in from a technology perspective and from a design perspective keep you more safe from those things. But I think I would be naive to stand up here and say that solves all the problems. We simply haven't found all the problems yet. So I think it's a good question.
Question here from Slido. In a situation where AI gives bad or misinformed advice, who is liable? The developer, the company, the user?
That's a good question, and I don't think we have a clear answer to that just now. I don't think that's necessarily a solved problem prior to AI. In some cases it is. But yeah, it really depends. And I think there's a lot of exploration. One of the big areas that I think we're going to see explode in the coming years is a focus from legal teams, from HR teams, from people-focused teams on what these things really mean. There's probably not enough investment. And actually, quite scarily at the moment, I think we're starting to see an exodus of some of the people that are focused on those types of challenges from some of the big companies. So I think that's quite scary. But yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that one, I've got to be honest.
Does Joe Public have a choice in any of this? You know, or is this basically, ultimately, the future we're heading towards, like it or lump it?
That's a great question. I mean, you look at social media. We've not managed to legislate social media. You look at all the damage that it's caused. In many ways, that is our first at-scale interaction with artificial intelligence, and we've probably failed really quite miserably. So that's been kind of pushed on us by big corps, albeit that dopamine addiction, I think, is pulling us into it. I think one of the things that we've got with some of the new technologies that are coming through that probably forces things a bit more, and it's really quite scary, is the opportunity for efficiencies, effectiveness, and productivity. And that's something I'm hearing at board level on an ongoing basis. No organisation wants to be left behind. No organisation wants to be missing out on that opportunity. So actually, that very senior buy-in is driving a lot of this movement really quickly. It's almost like an arms race at the moment. I think how different organisations handle it specifically is interesting. So Wobot Health, for example, the organisation I mentioned earlier, they do a phenomenal job of being really transparent about what they do and what they don't do with your data, and give you options about opting in and opting out to that. But because that's not legislated, not every organisation is going to do that.
I'm going to personalise this and stick you basically on the spot. If I gave you godlike powers, even more godlike powers than you currently possess, and you had the ability at the press of a button to wipe out this technology and not take those risks, not lead this into the future, would you press it?
You know, I would probably ask you to go a bit further back and wipe out mobile phones. I think there's a lot of technology. I'm a technologist at heart. I dearly love technology. I'm fascinated when you see the impact of these technologies on society, on people, and what we can do, especially when you see the good that we can do. But I really do think we're pushing at the boundaries. We're perhaps heading towards a great filter of some kind. We're always pushing ourselves further, trying that little bit more. And I don't think we're keeping up with technology. The technology is developing faster than we are. So, yeah, I think possibly I would.
This audience is a self-selecting sample to a certain extent. Stick your hand up if you're concerned, if you have concerns about the application of this technology in the future. Yeah, I would say it's about 50%.
That's encouraging.
It is encouraging. It is encouraging. It means somebody's going to be paying attention. Any other questions from the floor? Right, I'm going to stick with Slido then. Are we past peak hype for generative AI? Do you think businesses have unrealistic expectations of what the technology can do?
Yes and no. There is a lot of hype just now. However, I think we're a very long way from understanding what we can do with the technology. Our organisations since the 50s have been organised around building very traditional types of software, and you simply don't turn that juggernaut around in a very short period of time. So quite often when we work with organisations and they start trying to adopt these technologies, you start to see all those challenges in practice, process, culture really starting to cause challenges. And that's a lot of the time, it's not the technical challenges that we have to work with organisations on, it's some of those cultural practice and process challenges. So yes, there's a lot of hype. However, we're a long way from actually being able to leverage even the basic capabilities of these technologies. So I would actually probably liken this much more to general purpose technologies like electricity. You know, in the very early days of electricity, you would have very specific uses of that. But you don't now talk about we're going to a conference powered by electricity. It's just everywhere now. But it took decades to get to that point. And actually, if you look at the progression of general purpose technologies, the last few general purpose technologies, each progressive one was adopted faster. So I think we probably will adopt this faster than we did the internet and faster than we did electricity, but we're actually a long way from it embedding itself into all areas of life and society, which I think it will do.
Is that a good analogy, though? Because no one has ever asked me to form a relationship with a light bulb.
Well, I think it's a good analogy in the sense of the pervasiveness, the potential pervasiveness of it in society. But I think you call out something, we're essentially the first being that we're aware of to introduce a more intelligent thing into the ecosystem, into the food chain, you could almost argue. So I think you're right, that it's not the same. You know, electricity doesn't power new electricity. The internet doesn't create a new internet. This AI could create another AI. You know, it can build upon itself. So it's fundamentally different to technologies that's gone before, but I think it's like a general purpose technology in that it could get all the way across society and life.
Absolutely fascinating. Lots and lots of questions there. I'm going to round it up there. Can I ask you to thank Gary one more time, please?